Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ken Goodman. I have the privilege of directing the University of Miami's ethics programs and its Institute for Bioethics and Health Policy. You are here today for a special collaborative event between the Institute for Data Science and Computing, IDSC, and the Institute for Bioethics and the ethics programs, a joint collaboration that has fostered some of our most interesting work in ethics and information technology. You're here for a special presentation by a guy who is actually around the corner. It turns out that our visiting speaker is quite literally visiting. He's in Miami, and I am reliably informed that he is around the corner in, yes, you guessed it, a ride-sharing vehicle. But I, in the meantime, am going to start introducing him, and think that will save him time when he actually arrives and walks in that door just there. So as you saw from the notice, that John Havens is Executive Director of the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethics of Autonomous Intelligent Systems. His work in that organization has produced a number of really important documents related to this, namely capturing both the importance of the document, but also the concept, namely ethically aligned design, a vision for prioritizing human well-being with autonomous and intelligent systems. I remember several years ago, a very important IDSC meeting was all about design, and the people who actually write the code, conceive the systems, respond to user requests and sometimes demands, and how challenging that can be. At the end of the day, what I think is realized, and one of the reasons why the collaboration between IDSC and the ethics communities here is so very important, is that one can't do that without attention to issues of responsibility, software engineering ethics, and concerns we have all in the last couple of years come to be far more aware of, namely challenges related to bias and diversity. So against that background, when John begins his presentation, where he's been informed that we want to try and keep it so there's plenty of time for questions, he's going to be describing his work and the important role of ethics in design of intelligent systems. I want to make a few remarks about IEEE and the acronym. There's something interesting that's happened. I was talking to somebody the other day and referred to IBM. It's a large company you may have heard of before. I said, does anybody know what IBM stands for? And it turns out that no one in the room knew what IBM was an acronym for. It is International Business Machines. I'm a member of another organization, ACMI, ACMI. Used to be the American, ACMI, the American Medical, involving dementia is a terrible thing, conflating two acronyms. But AMIA, the American Medical Informatics Association, wanted to distance itself from its acronym because it had the word medical in it, and there are a lot of allied health professionals who are not physicians. So American Medical Informatics Association becomes AMIA. IBM, there's a lot more than International Business Machines, there's a lot more than business machines, becomes IBM. And the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers, IEEE. Hello there.
Hey, how you doing?
I was giving a story, John, about acronyms, and so. No, you're sitting here and I'm moving.
Okay.
And so the IEEE, one of the world's foremost organizations in information technology, began as an organization that was devoted to electrical engineering. In fact, there's far more than that now, and it is. I just introduced you.
Wonderful.
So
Thank
you haven't missed anything.
All right.
And so with that, I just described what you do at IEEE, your work, and a little bit about ethically aligned design.
Wonderful. Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Sorry I was late. I miscalculated my Uber with Art Basel. So if you're in Miami, and I've been having a great time at Art Basel. But thank you so much for the introduction. And I know we have the rest of the hour. So I'm going to try to zip through this presentation in about 15 or 20 minutes. And I would love to then take questions if that works for you, Ken, for everyone else.
It does. Giannina, I'm going to need your help on the Q&A, however, if you could arrange for that when it becomes time.
Yes, of course.
Thanks.
And thanks to Giannina and everyone for organizing this and all the wonderful promotion. That was really gracious of you when it was pretty last minute on my part to come down. When I talk about responsible innovation, and Ken, thanks again for talking about ethically aligned design and IEEE. we're going to get into it. And I just did another talk this morning, was actually with Morocco, which was really fun, and talking about human rights. The term responsible innovation is usually used, or it has been oftentimes in the business world, but more and more it's also been the social science world. And ethics, for how we've been doing ethics with IEEE in this work, is really sort of more, or not sort of, it is applied ethics versus sort of morality. Anyway, just wanted to give you a basis of that. But IEEE, as Ken already mentioned, if you already talked about the history of the organization, I'll skip that, except to say that the tagline is this tagline: advancing technology for humanity. But when I first got involved in this work about 6 years ago, a wonderful guy by the name of Konstantinos Karahalios, who is the managing director of the Standards Association. And I work in the Standards Association, which is one of about 6 operating units within IEEE. It's very large. And the Standards Association helped create things like the Wi-Fi standards. So we're on this call because of IEEE, or technically because of volunteers. Volunteers make up IEEE, and I lead committees with volunteers. And I'll be pitching Ken and all of you to join these committees because they're free and they're open to all to join. That said, this word "for" is circled because I realized, Konstantinos realized, this is a critical word in the sense of what does advancing technology for humanity even mean? Meaning, what does the word advance mean? But for humanity means you have to, at a design level, recognize what it is you're building, when, and then how you're going to validate it that it's a success. So in the business world, I used to be an EVP of a top 10 PR firm. We used the acronym, if Ken was doing the acronyms, KPI, key performance indicators. Engineers and data scientists often say, what are we optimizing for? But essentially, what does success mean? And that's a critical word when thinking about responsible innovation and the AI ethics work I'm going to talk more about now. So what is the current, in general, focus of non-human or non-human-centric innovation? And one thing as a disclaimer, I should say, these are my views, John, and they represent a lot of the volunteers' work that I help drive, but they don't necessarily formally represent all of IEEE, just because it's a massive organization. But human-centric innovation, or human-in-the-loop AI, being very general, essentially means that humans always have a way to sort of stop something. If there's, say, a weapon, or if there's a car, there's ways that humans can intervene. And at the design level, but also once an AI system, product, or service is being used, a human can intervene and be involved. That's human in the loop. Human-centric is more on this area. Now, I'm not trying to pick on Facebook or any Silicon-based or Silicon Valley-based company or any company. But the reason I'm bringing up Facebook is in terms of asking about optimization. There's the sort of sense of what are we always optimizing either our individual lives for, or at a societal or business level, what are we optimizing for? This is a wonderful case study from my friend Jonathan Stray, who used to work with the Partnership on AI, a wonderful organization with multiple Silicon Valley-based companies like Google, et cetera, that are a part of Facebook. And this was a really admirable effort by Facebook to do meaningful social interactions on Facebook. Now, I'm on Facebook. If you're on Facebook, you've probably had meaningful social interactions. But this was more designed to increase aspects of human well-being beyond, say, like seeing your friends and whatever else, and measure them. So the ultimate sort of benefit, however, as you can see circled in red, the real key performance indicator, ultimately, well, of course, these other things were goals, but the main measurement was increased advertising revenue. And for Facebook and companies like Google, not necessarily Alphabet, but Google and Facebook, that's what they are. They're advertising companies. Now, do they do other things? Of course, but in terms of their revenue, and in terms of, in this case, what it is that they focus on and measure, that's what this was about. And I'm using this as an example, again, not to say any organization or making profits is, quote, bad, right? That's what we're going to dig into more in terms of responsible innovation. But there are design constraints where you can't ignore a systems thinking mindset with what you do. You can't say we're going to build this AI product in isolation. You're doing it on top of, as it were, the economic ways to have that technology be created. So one of my favorite, I should say, economists is Joseph Stiglitz. Most of my other favorite economists are women. And the reason for that is the GDP, or gross domestic product, that really had its basis about 70 years ago, starting in a place called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, after the Second World War, which is a place, this event was where the IMF, the World Bank, was created, but it's also where world leaders said, what is it that we think is most important to focus on for the world right now? And in general, after the Second World War, much of the world lay in ruin, physical rubble. And so exponential growth, meaning actually building the infrastructure up again, was the zeitgeist of the time. It was a critical thing to do. However, the exponential growth mindset at that meeting, what was established is the universal aspect of the American dollar, and this mindset that exponential growth, fiscally measured largely or almost completely by financial means, was what would determine societal, air quote, big air quote, well-being, right? That society would do well if GDP increases. Shockingly, in 2021, this is still the main metric used by the whole planet. At that time, what was not factored into the GDP? Caregiving, and that involves education, and frankly, women. And this idea is, there's a wonderful book called If Women Counted by Marilyn Waring, one of my heroes, an economist who made that point, that if women are not seen literally by the metrics that measure the world, they will not be included in anything. Like it's so vast, it's sometimes hard to even talk about. Same thing with the environment. When the GDP was created, it was not factored into the measurements of things like money. So for instance, if a big oil tanker crashes into an island and spills massive amounts of oil, destroying all those ecosystems, or maybe even the businesses of the fisheries or whatever in that area, the GDP goes up because more jobs are created and there may be money from those jobs. But the next 10 to 20 years, all the jobs may be gone, etc. And so the GDP then goes down, and it's not an accurate measure in and of itself. So all that is to lay the groundwork of saying people like Stiglitz since 2008, with a commission of multiple economists, said is GDP or something else better to measure human well-being, environmental sustainability. And well-being is not just your mood or emotion, it's what's called long-term flourishing. It's physical health, mental health, access to education, being with people you love. And the decision by these thought leaders in 2008 in something called the Stiglitz Commission, and it's a verbatim quote here, human well-being is easier to measure than productivity. So why is this a big deal? And why is this relevant to artificial intelligence? So if you're following the AI regulation space, one thing you know is that right now in the EU, the European Union, most of the thinking about how to move forward with aspects of AI regulation is taking place. So you're probably familiar with the GDPR, maybe that was one of Ken's acronyms. The aspect of protecting human data has never been more critical, because when you say AI, to me, it's like saying the internet. It could be simple machine learning that we've had for a decade. It could be deep learning done by places like Google and what have you. It could be artificial general intelligence, which many people think is largely speculation. The point is that human data is involved in almost all of these different transactions. So data is critical. But this is a quote taken from the EU high-level experts group that really 3 or 4 years ago began to create the legislation that's now being mirrored in the United States. The UNESCO AI regulation or document that came out just 3 weeks ago, similarly, is based off this. And what's exciting for me is many of the experts who helped create ethically aligned design, people like Francesco Rossi from IBM, Virginia Dignam, created this document, which you're reading here. So the reason I have these points bolded is to say that AI is not an end in itself, but rather a promising means to increase human flourishing. Like any technology, by itself, it may not be positive or negative, but it's not inert. Here, the logic is, why not use it to increase human flourishing? And on the bottom, you can see the quote is, also monitor progress or the metrics of sustainability, right? So basically, the simple way to think about this in kind of business terms is what's called the triple bottom line: people, planet, or profit. And actually here at Art Basel, a lot of people are saying a quadruple bottom line, adding in art, which is a way that humans actually look at their surroundings and communicate about them. But basically, the environment and human well-being need to be factored first in design. And then that's also where profits, sustainable profits, come from. And you can see I'm kind of mixing business and AI, academia, social science, and ethics, because I'm this weird hybrid where my background as an actor, I'm a writer, and I have this wonderful job of getting to meet people like Ken and all of you, and really be a community builder and a strategist. And then my writing and work is to kind of like mush it all together. It's a very official term, mush it all together. Okay, this is kind of the IEEE stuff where Ken may have touched on it. The basic idea here is we'd love for you to get involved in our work. Ethically Aligned Design, the document, is Creative Commons. The last version in 2019 has been used by IBM, UNESCO. We worked with OECD to create their AI principles. It's been cited, I think now in hundreds, at least multiple dozens of documents. Probably because it's really long. It's 300 pages and over 700 people worked on it. The thing I like talking about the most is after the first edition, we asked for feedback, got 500 pages, and multiple people told us, great document, it feels very Western. And I bring this up because I was like, I don't know what that means. And the bias of me, I'm from the States, being a Westerner, I hadn't heard that term before. So we had people from Japan, South Korea, China, a lot of people from Mexico, India say you cannot be globally focused talking about ethics and AI and not recognize that the Western bias, the bias does not necessarily mean negative. It just means your cultural or whatever background. It can be negative. Negative bias, of course, exists. But in this case, what are you coming from? Western ethics in general is what's called dualistic, kind of binary, yes, no, and then also kind of focused on rationality, just from the Greeks, etc. Whereas a lot of Eastern traditions, Confucianism, Ubuntu ethics, focused on more of a communal side of things. So rationality and relationality, which is, I'm quoting from a great paper about Ubuntu ethics, is what we recommend. Anyway, I'm gonna skip some of this so we can get to questions. Is that okay, or do you want me to go on?
So the pace you're going through.
Okay, because I know I'm hurling a lot at you. So, and I can talk fast. When I'm in Europe, I try to talk slower. Sometimes I realize I finish a 20-minute talk and no one knew what I said. So ethically aligned design is what we call a pre-standardization document, where we released it to the public so it could be useful right away. But IEEE Standards Association makes standards. That's what we're about. And so the Wi-Fi standard that I mentioned, when a standard is created, at least for IEEE, it means dozens, sometimes hundreds of people get together for anywhere from 2 to 5 years and work up until this standard, which I'll talk about in a minute, on the technological interoperability of a certain tech. So the Wi-Fi standards, and I say standards because there's now multiple versions of that standard, took years to make with about 300 people, because 10 or 12, 15 years ago, people were saying, is this going to be Bluetooth? Is it going to be LAN networks? Is it going to be geofencing? Whatever it was. And standards, as it turns out, are not just technically focused. They're very business oriented, because businesses want to produce certain technologies that will be adopted into a standard. They're also very policy oriented, because policymakers who are not technologists will say, hey, that standard that's created, let's adopt that into policy, because all these technologists work for years, so why recreate the wheel, which is quite smart, actually. The 7000 standard is the first in the history of IEEE's Standards Association, which is about 50 years old. The whole organization is about 100 years old. In 50 years, this is the first standard that marries technological interoperability formally with the study of socio-technical issues, which is huge. It's such a big deal and such a gift from the engineering community to say, essentially, let's give this a shot. The first couple of years we started this, I spoke to a lot of engineers, and they would say, ethics is not our focus, meaning formal applied ethics. And they're right, meaning if you're an engineer, you're not necessarily an applied ethicist. However, what we found out very quickly was to say, as a compliment to engineers who are standing on the shoulders of giants, if you're trying to avoid risk, etc., but you don't have, like say when you produce an Alexa, someone on your team who understands social science or women's rights, then when, for instance, I'm not trying to pick an Alexa, I'm using a case study. When Alexa was released, many women's groups and human rights groups after about the first 6 months, when it was already in millions of people's homes, said, maybe we shouldn't have all of our children yelling at a box that's got a woman's voice attached to it, so that kids are being trained that women are subservient. Now, again, I'm not trying to pick on Alexa, and I'm not trying to say that the way to say that, what I just said, is accurately reflecting all the concern. But the point is, we're saying, do those design questions and those values-based questions at the front end of design. And that's where the responsible innovation takes place. The responsible part of the case that I just gave means if you have a social scientist on the team, they can say, hey, we really should think about women's rights, children's rights, whatever. And the engineers and data scientists, of course, will say, we hope and we think, thank you very much. This is risk we have not been trained to do. And then the innovation part is when you ask those questions and say, well, maybe women won't like this. And then you say, well, our voice assistant will have a male voice, a female voice, and a gender neutral voice, which, by the way, thanks to Amazon, they made that option after the outcry. But if they'd done that first, think of what a distinction that might have been to build trust and build sales. That's the innovation part. It's asking more questions about end user values. So 7000 is a standard that marries this formal, what's called value-based engineering methodology, which is kind of like PR social science that I used to do in the marketing world, to traditional systems engineering. So it's kind of taking one big group of thinkers and helping them speak the same language. But if we are hoping this becomes as ubiquitous as, say, like an ISO 9000, or a tool that everyone uses when they start to create their technology. Because if they don't, we're not trying to be negative, but say that then you are not doing due diligence in the algorithmic era. You're not saying what are the end user values, marginalized populations, black and brown skinned people, left-handed people, whatever it is. It's a design question, not just their values, but how people live their lives. 7000 is designed to help with that. 7010, I was the founding chair of the last standard. I was the founding chair of this standard. I switched. Other people then became chairs, which was great because they both were fantastic. This is what we call a societal impact assessment tool. And like Joseph Stiglitz talked about using well-being versus GDP, there are multiple, dozens and dozens of data-laden indicators beyond GDP, meaning using GDP, don't throw it out, but along with GDP to measure things like the environment, the UN SDGs, probably, hopefully. And then there's things, what's called the Social Progress Index. And whole countries like New Zealand are using these tools, for instance, measuring the mental health of their kids. And these are things you can measure physiologically, things like giving someone a bracelet that has a wristband that can measure sweat as a proxy for nervousness. Right now in the advertising industry, when we type on our keyboards or use our thumbs or eye tracking, all these things physiologically indicate aspects of our mental health. There are billions and trillions of dollars using all these tools to measure what we want to buy. Cool, but those same tools can be measured for a sense of increasing people's mental health positively and their well-being. So the societal impact assessment mainly is about teaching people the triple bottom line and saying these indicators exist, and then helping them create an actual formal kind of picking from those three boxes. And then saying when you design your AI product, system, or service, now use one of each of these indicators at least. And then you can say we are provably increasing what's called environmental flourishing or human well-being. And one thing that's key to remember that we're really, the term preaching is okay to use. Avoiding risk is kind of the job, right? Meaning thank you to every engineer and data scientist who knows to make the elevator that I wrote up in here in the school today safe. That is not minor. And avoiding physical harm and risk and the mental risks that may already be known, seriously, thank you. But where those harms, if we just were to avoid risk, then we have a world where we aren't asking, but how do we improve? What is the society we want to make? And also if the environment isn't improved, avoiding risk is not enough, right? That's what we learned from COP. The Paris Agreement isn't working, etc. Everything we design can't just be designed to not hurt the world more. It must be designed to improve the world. Or by 2030, 9 years from now, who will all get to be involved in the world? Same thing with mental health. Such an amazing opportunity after COVID, with all the stress that people have been facing, to say, how can every tool be used to help people avoid depression, connect people to each other, and then again, make these tools something where that improves mental health. And by the way, the good news, New Zealand is proving this, Great Britain is proving this, so many businesses like Danone are proving this, Timberland. When you increase these things, they make better long-term sustainability investments. They actually have better long-term profits, not necessarily exponential profits, but long-term profits, because you're thinking long-term versus short-term. We're doing some great work with data and kids. We're doing a big AI certification program, like a good housekeeping seal of AI. I can tell you any more about this, but I figured I'd wrap up and then go to questions. Responsible innovation, or human-centric, values-driven innovation, must prioritize human well-being, must prioritize environmental sustainability. Prioritize meaning the first questions in design have to be, when we build this, not will it make, how will it make money, or what money will it make when? I mean, those are important questions, but the first questions are, we want to build X, this new phone, this autonomous vehicle. How will it increase human well-being and sustainability? Once you know those answers, using tools like 7010 or others, then you figure out with the responsible innovation tools like 7000, and by the way, not just IEEE tools, I'm just using these as examples, how these two things can happen first. Then profits come from there, long-term sustainable profits. And that's about it.
Let me thank you for that. That was a really nice overview about the utility and practical role of somewhat redundantly applied ethics in the circumstances. If you're going to build a tool, you probably ought to find out how the people using it are going to be able to use it most effectively. But you also touched on a really important tension. If you frame it that way, no one will disagree. But the cultural values you identified are, not just globally, but in our own country, sources of really intense disagreement. And managing those, especially if you're IEEE or the International Standards Organization, ISO, is a real challenge. And it's the ancient debate between, for lack of better terms, autonomy. We North Americans do love our autonomy and our liberty. Well, I've even heard we have colleagues who think they have a liberty interest in not wearing a mask. I know I'm as amazed as you are. On the other hand, as opposed to, for example, and this comes from the concept of Ubuntu, or Europeans are keen to remind us about solidarity. Am I in it for me, or am I in it for us? And how do we balance those two ancient and really quite powerful tensions in terms of a standard? Say more about that in terms of what you've been working on.
So first of all, I should say standards working groups, once they're established, and this is with IEEE, say Ken said, I want to create a standard on AI and trust with regards to autonomous vehicles. As long as there's a scope, because the scope has to be approved by the different committees in IEEE, then what happens is, if Ken was chair, he'd come in, but anyone can join that group. And when anyone joins that group, what's really challenging is, but in one sense, it's kind of what you hope, that as Ken mentioned, the tensions, you want people to join who do have tensions with each other, in the sense of who disagree. Consensus, sometimes people don't even like consensus, so coming to consensus on consensus is actually a challenge. But if you think about, if you get enough people, and it's, I'll call it a tactic, although it's not meant to be underhanded, and I'm telling you about it, so it's disclosed, is to try to invite, like at the mask issue is a great example. Well, let's invite 20 people that fervently say you have to wear masks all the time and get vaxxed, and 20 people that say they don't. Say you were building some kind of AI to measure the accuracy of certain vaccinations in Miami, right? But then both groups, the encouragement would be, since IEEE is a technological and science-based society or group, is to say, invite the people in who can, quote, prove whatever you're trying to prove. Now, this is where you're going to get heated arguments, and both sides will bring in people that they say are accredited or whatever. But as a rule, and this is not to be negative or discredit any thinker per se, but the science of the technology wins in the sense of where there's validated empirical testing about whatever, then that usually forms the basis. Now, that said, the consensus in voting still happens, and I've been a part of different standards processes where there may be X number of people voting for something, and it's voted not necessarily on the basis of whatever. So anyway, if that's too general, the point is that standards are not not me building this phone and saying, here's the phone, right? They're almost more of a communications tool, that the real power they get is from that consensus. But anyway, what I found is and I'm going to move the masks and vaccination discussion to the side because it's very political and heated. But when you have technological discussions, and you kind of tell when someone has an agenda, right? Like they're like, I think we should use IoT technologies, this one. And maybe it's their company, maybe they just really believe it. And then you start voting and you have the whole team vote, the whole working group vote. And if someone says, hey, John, thanks for your idea, but stop talking, you move on. So I know I'm talking, Ken, more about the process of standards, but sometimes people haven't done it. I hadn't before I joined. And that's the point there is that IEEE doesn't dictate what happens. They create the tools to have the consensus.
I have another question, assuming I cannot find others here. But one of the interesting interesting conceptual questions about standards themselves. One of them, and it's my favorite example of when a standard ought to change, has to do with an ancient, well, it's 100 years old. It's called, in fact, if you want to look it up, it's you can Google the phrase Tugboat Radio. 100 years ago, one of the Great Lakes, there's a tug firm that's moving cargo from one port to another on the Great Lake. And this barge is out in the middle of the lake, and a storm comes up, and it sinks, and they lose all the cargo. So the people who lost the cargo sue the owner of the boat, saying, you know, you should have had one of those radio things that they've got nowadays. If you only had a radio, you would have known about the storm, and you wouldn't have risked our cargo. And it goes to trial, and the judge rules in favor of the plaintiffs. Well, the defendant says, hey, this wasn't, we knew there were these radios out there, but they weren't a standard. Everyone didn't have them. The judge said, that's actually not important in this context. Your duty was to protect the cargo. Here was a tool that would have done it. And if you could think about that in terms of the evolution of standards and their acceptance, because IEEE has been ahead of the curve in a number of different ways in that regard.
That's a great example. I didn't know that one. Maybe I'll be quoting you on that one.
Tugboat Radio.
Yeah. I think, and I'm new to the standards world, so I wouldn't, like Constantine, this one I mentioned, besides him being the managing director, has deep expertise. I think Wi-Fi is a good example, right? No one, or at least most of my non-technical friends, you walk into a room and you say, what's the password? But that's something that at a human level, kids age 4, anywhere on the planet, access to the internet is only 50% of the world-ish. But in general, like everyone here on the phone, like how long have you known to say what's the password? Those 3 words in whatever language mean you have access to the rest of the world's information. So, again, IEEE didn't, the organization made that happen, but because of the volunteers. So that's where standards can be incredibly powerful, to Ken's point, because also someone might say, why didn't you make Wi-Fi available or what have you? In our case, the 7000 standards, first and foremost, we want these to be, in old school PR terms or business terms, carrot versus the stick. The carrot is, and I haven't worked in PR for years, is actually just true. I'll give you an example. I worked for a very large diaper company. I won't name their name, but you probably know who they are. And it was early on in social media days with Twitter. I was like number 500 person to join Twitter just because I was a big geek at the time and still am. Anyway, one of the people at this big company, a guy, I'm saying that because he wasn't a mom, made a comment about a top mom blogger at that point and what she'd said on her diaper, her blog about testing this company's diapers. And it blew up in our faces, the PR team and that company, because he said something. The mom had said that she tried this diaper and that her baby got a rash. And this guy wrote to her, maybe even on the blog, and said, that's impossible. We've tested this diaper with thousands of babies. Your baby can't have a rash. And she had pictures, right? And very smart woman anyway. But the point is like, anyone knows, let's not talk to moms in this way for a company who's selling diapers. Anyway, stuff happens, and I'm not trying to put this guy down or the company down. But the point is that methodologies early on would have avoided that massive PR crisis. Because for good reason, this mom was like, okay, here's the pictures, and the only thing that changed in my baby's life was your diaper. And the standard side of things, what we're trying to standardize is that if you use these tools like 7000 to ask what are the end user values of what you're building, it will take more time at the beginning of the process. This is what's most challenging to businesses, because until shareholder law changes, companies, we can blame companies if we want, but the law says make the most money you can for your shareholders as fast as you can. This is a design constraint. And I'm always fascinated and irritated when I'm in meetings and people say, don't hinder innovation with this ethics stuff. And my answer is, business, the way it's set up, hinders innovation more. And this is even before going into IP and copyright law and patents, by saying everything must go to market fast. So this might sound crazy, like, but how do we change the world's business models? Good news. BlackRock, Silicon Valley's largest, maybe the world's largest, I think, VC, venture capitalist firm, said about a year and a half ago, the guy that runs BlackRock, until companies can prove that they're what's called ESG, environmental, societal, governance standards, show that they are actually changing their operations level processes and work within their organizations, that they're actually working to improve sustainability, like I just said, then shareholders won't invest in them. Here's a crazy idea: ask long-term investments. I'm only laughing because God bless BlackRock, but saying to someone, you're not a good long-term investment because you're not doing long-term investing, that could not sound more simple. But that is the basis of what we're facing from an existential crisis level with the environment. In 9 years, I know so many young people that have been saying to me, I don't want to have kids because I don't want kids to come into this world. And that's just on the environmental side, right? Anyway, the positive side of all this is to say, two companies, hey, if you need that ESG reporting per BlackRock and Bank of America, something like a 7000 starts to filter into, and 7010, thinking about this stuff. And then back to your example on the tugboat, the standard that we really want is for people to do the due diligence of the responsible innovation design. It's not saying every company, here's your output. It's saying what needs to happen is, if you don't have a way of saying, and we also have the certification thing I mentioned, then you're not provably showing that you're trying to even do this. And that way you won't be able to report back to your shareholders, and the end user values won't be measured. And then most importantly, you probably are not helping improve the planet and people.
Important point that's been something that colleagues in business ethics have been trying to make for a while, namely that if you think that this is an impediment to your profits, you haven't thought it through carefully enough, right? That they're not incompatible, and that most ordinary people, I mean, no one's going to either believe, or certainly they won't articulate it out loud, that, for instance, I want to acquire vast personal wealth from the misfortunes of other people. That's my business strategy, right? I mean, it's just not the way that most people, although there are criminals in the world, right? And some of them are in business, but overarchingly, most people aren't. And overarchingly, most people would just as soon do the right thing and profit that way. There is a question there, and are your eyes better than mine?
I can read this. I have reading glasses, but
then they are
okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you read that question out loud?
Yes, and I'll probably mispronounce your name wrong, but Roshio Ju, Joo, so Ju, hopefully, said, thank you for such a great presentation. Well, thank you. That's very kind. Could you give an example of how standards could be Western focused instead of globally inclusive? Yes. So my dear friend Edson Prestes, who's the chair of a standard that just launched last week, yay, Preston, in the working group, called IEEE 7007. It's about an ontology for robotics, so taxonomy definitions around robotics. Years ago, and he's based in Brazil, so this was really helpful because he's, from the global South versus Northeast, North America and Europe and Western Europe. He said, picture a robot that's got a head, and you're building this robot with a human morphology, and it's got eyes. The morphology just means how the robot looks. And you're from the West, and so you say, here's a cool robot, and it's got really expressive eyes that blink like this, and that look right in the eyes of the person who uses the robot as a way to be friendly, right? He says, but then when you ship to China and that robot opens up and goes like this, the person might go like this. And China's vast. So I'm only saying as an example, cultures where looking right in the eyes of someone right away is considered rude. This is a very simple example of cultural values. It's not ethics. I'll talk about ethics in a second in this regard. But it's simply saying, have you asked what the end user values and ethics are in that region? And then Edson made a great point back to 7,000 that I just mentioned. And now his standard, or the group standard, 7,007. At the design level, then someone could go, well, how about we make the eyes on a swivel for the robot? And then if it ships in Western regions, there's a thing that says, as a user, disclose this the same way you disclose GDPR data stuff. Realize that the robot's eyes are not set, and it's got these main three settings, kind of neutral, Western, or Eastern, right? I'm just making that up. This then becomes both a design distinction and a marketing distinction. And in terms of selling, making profits, again, when I say profits, sustainable profits means your company exists and people make money who work there, and you bring value to your customers. The exponential growth going largely to shareholders. And by the way, shareholders are critical. So I want to be, this is not anti-shareholders. But the whole point is that if designing doesn't change, and then I'm only, Ken, what you said about do the right thing. The right thing is a good moral issue to discuss. The design thing is to say, are you actually recognizing, in this example, like the China example? Anyway, I can go more on the Western versus Eastern ethics and recommend some papers, but I'll see if there's more questions first. And thanks for that.
Have you noticed that a lot of the droid-like devices are made out of white plastic?
Yes. In fact, I forget that, I think it's 85% of all robotic morphology. And there's a great paper on this. It may have changed. This is from 8 years ago. 85% of all robots, ready for this, are designed as either white or Asian women. Thanks very much. Who makes most of the robots? Young white dudes. So nothing wrong with young white dudes or older white dudes. Like I'm one of them. But the point is that to say, why are we not building robots or droids that look like the people who are going to be using them? It doesn't make sense. And also the color, or the shade of white in art, in Art Basel, and I've only been realizing this, when that's the prominent color or shade that's used, that can be very political, motivated, and more importantly, if you're using these design methodologies and ask, hey, where are these robots going to be used? Largely in Latina or cultures or areas with people of color, black and brown skin. Then why wouldn't you have robots that reflect that society or community? And more importantly, we're very big on what's called a participatory design. And participatory design means the designers can't and shouldn't make all the decisions. In fact, the main thing they should do is to say, hey, we're thinking of building this phone or whatever. Where the communities that are going to use it is bring them into the design process. So if there are people of color, marginalized people, indigenous populations, whatever, it's not that hard. Bring them into the design process and ask them to be in a working group and then listen to them. And the thing that we found with indigenous, for instance, cultures, which is, it's so vast, it's like saying people. There's so many different indigenous traditions. But the Maori tradition in New Zealand, again, multiple strains of that, if that's the right term. We have a wonderful young guy on one of our committees talking about the nature of data being a form of where there's Western sort of data coming into New Zealand. The Maori tradition, apparently faith-based traditions, you go into rooms where no recording devices are allowed. Not a pen and paper, not an audio recording, not a video recording. So there's a sanctity and a sacred aspect of this sharing of information. A. B, because Western data, by and large, tend to be binary, 1, 0, yes, no, right? Very dualistic, which is not from this, what this young man talks about, what the Maori tradition is. The sort of, and what's funny is there's a term called natural data, natural language processing. Even that term, natural language, what does that mean? And when these data tools come in with well-intentioned thinkers, to your point, Ken, people are not necessarily thinking, I'm going to go colonize New Zealand with our data. But what he says is that is exactly, and colonization is a very tough term. It's very political. So I'm quoting him.
Freighted.
it's freighted. But if you think about someone completely ignoring the local traditions and the local wisdom, it's not about are we nice people or whatever. It's why are you designing in such a way that you aren't thinking? It's like designing for a winter environment and bringing in a summer car. I have a car I'm building and I'm trying to sell it to Nome, Alaska. I haven't done any study on winter. It's certainly offensive, but it's also just, we keep focusing on quote bad design because we want to take some of the morality out of it, so that due diligence is just, you don't know what's bad until you do the work. Do the work.
The idea of a data neutral zone is really quite interesting. Indigenous North Americans, in part because their information has been used by others, sometimes in ways that have been exploitive, are evolving. Well, the work is evolving on what the concept of data sovereignty. But back to IEEE and your work, because we only have a few more minutes left. There's in medical informatics, I only made a hash when I was trying to do a discussion about acronyms. I made a mess of one, the American Medical Informatics Association, which is AMIA. There's a joke around AMIA that goes something like this. I love standards. It's a good thing there's so many of them. Right. Yeah. And so the challenge is the large one about adoption of standards, the development and what you've described in the work of the IEEE and the ISO and other standard organizations is really important. But in fact, if I'm a business person, I'm an AI in this case, but it could be any kind of product developer, and I want to do the right thing. In your last remarks, link the adoption of standards to a good business practices, good ethical practice. Why bother to adopt any standard at all if I can get away with something cheaper?
No, it's a good question. I think the term good business practice is the first thing I'll ask. What does that mean? Good business practice at the end of the day means exponential growth. Period. I'm not interested. I'm saying this, Ken, not to you. I'm saying this as John, not IEEE. I don't care about, quote, good business practice as status quo, because good business practice doesn't prioritize the environment, doesn't prioritize ultimately people holistically. It keeps marginalized people marginalized. And in general, if you want to use the term from the amazing Shoshana Zuboff from Harvard, everything on the internet in general is built on what's called surveillance capitalism, period. Like, and I get passionate about it. I don't mean to sound angry. It's just like saying, is Ken wearing a gray checked shirt? And if we all agree that's a gray checked shirt, it's just empirical fact. Like, and it's
the gray part, maybe.
Well, okay, fair enough. I think it's great shirt, gray and great. But the shareholder thing I mentioned is also to recognize that businesses that, quote, want to do good or change anything, if it's law, it's law. It's not like shareholders, and by the way, shareholders, they should get money for the investments they've created. So please keep in mind, I'm not saying no money and no profits. I'm saying the way the system exists, there's this like tiny amount of wiggle room for companies to do R&D, research and development, outside of maybe the exponential growth mindset. So I'm actually, me personally, it's not preaching, it's saying what ultimately leads to sustainability from a design standpoint. So let's just say we agree. We may not on the phone or web, and that's fine. But let's say it's 2030. By the time the world's ecosystems can't continue to sustain any business, and that means here in Miami, the seawall deteriorates, and you don't want to pay $2 billion this year, and it's going to cost $1 trillion next year. I'm making this up for Miami. I live in New Jersey. I never thought I'd have to deal with floods. I paid $17,000 in floods for Hurricane Ida, which was this aberration. The aberrations are becoming the norm. It is 9 years from now. And more importantly, as a society, and this is a quote from Greta Thunberg, right? She's 16 or 17 years old now. She said, if you do not start changing your ways, we, meaning the younger generation, will not forgive you. And I'm speaking largely of my generation. She's absolutely right. So good business practice, why?
That's the hardest question.
Why
That's,
do we use that phrase?
and in fact, in the world of information technology, you've identified a pretty broad array of position stances to the goals of the business. My business is to acquire as much short-term wealth as possible. Right? If that's your goal, that's going to be hard. That's Milton Friedman's school, the idea that the only thing a business owes is profit to its shareholders. That is, by the way, used to be kind of out there until a few politicians read Ayn Rand and thought they were libertarians, where the goal is actually that goal is unassailable. If I can make a quick killing in IT, in the market, or in something that's environmentally dangerous, oh well. And that oh well is in fact, I think what organizations like IEEE and others are trying to push back against by saying, if you bake these, if the values of your standards include the idea that there's more than simply an efficient machine, but a machine that attends to the human part of the human-centered design is what you could argue was obvious from the beginning. There just wasn't any money in it. And so trying to get it so that we can make it so there's money in it might be the way to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, this realism, and I know we have like 3 or 4 minutes left, so I'll wrap up my soapbox. And also, again, thank you so much. And I should say too, before I forget, the work that we do is called a website called ethicsinAction.IEEE.org. That's my email address. Love to have any of you involved. Again, some of these views are just, I'm John. And the point is that if you disagree with me, awesome, join the working groups. If you agree with me, cool. But we have so many committees. We have one focused on power and tech. A lot of these conversations in education committee. We have another one on, anyway, a lot of great committees. The thing, just to say to your last thing, first of all, the short answer is, I don't know. Like Milton Friedman, those things, those actually I do know. You said, I want to make a quick killing. It's an interesting choice of words, right? I'm a dad. I have 2 kids. They're 18 and 16. 2030 is 9 years from now. I don't know what the answer is when I'm in business meetings or whatever else, and there's not this sort of sense of, like if you and I were here and there was a fire alarm, we might look around for a minute, like the hotel I'm staying in has had 2 this week, there were mistakes. So you kind of get up and complain, and they're like, is it real? And I don't smell smoke. But if there was smoke, I would leave the room. So there's not just smoke with the environment, and then when you come to mental health, and I'm going to end on a positive note, but the first negative note is suicide in people ages 18 to 25 has increased 50% in the last 5 years. The nature of COVID increasing depression is such an opportunity to ask as a society, Milton Friedman, whoever else, I'm speaking as myself, do I want to see my kids suffer? Do we want all young people to suffer? Because some guy said years ago, this is the priority. Or 70 years ago, at the time when there were no women present and there's no one focused on the environment or caregiving, these rules were made. Are we doing this because we're just scared of change? I get that. You know what I'm more scared about? Floods and tornadoes. And I'm more scared of a society that says, we're not going to prioritize our children. And by the way, quick stat, World Health Organization, 2% of every government in the world is spent on mental health. However, 28% of those same budgets go to pay when mental health is not addressed. In the business world, I go on a whiteboard and I say, hey, here's 26% we can save. And I say nothing about mental health. You know what happens? I get the money I want in my budget the next quarter. So we can lie about it. I don't care. You know why? Because good business practice is not the focus any longer. The practice is empirically, is the world getting better? Yes or no? Is what you're building going to make that happen? And if the answer is no, then guess what? You don't have to build it. Is what you're building increasing long-term human flourishing? If the answer is no, certainly if it's going to cause harm, then the answer is don't build it. And if the answer, business people say, well, we can make money, then aggregate, doing the right thing is changing the status quo. And the opportunity again here is responsible innovation, research and development. When you simply just ask these questions about how can we help the planet and people, then your products actually improve in the sense that they provide more long-term benefit for all your stakeholders, employees, customers, and shareholders. The shareholders are living in the same world. They will also be there in 2030 when their house crumbles, when whatever else. So the only way forward is responsible innovation. And again, we hope have any of you join this work and make this happen.
Thank you so much, John. And in fact, more links to IEEE are on our website for the ethics programs. John Havens, thank you so very much for being here with us today. On behalf of the Institute for Data Science and Computing and the University of Miami's ethics programs and Institute for Bioethics and Health Policy, thank you all so very much for joining us this afternoon. This, I think, may be our last event of the year, so you've sealed off a pretty good year for us.
Thank you so much.
In beautiful fashion. Thank you all very much, and thank you to Gina again and all the staff at IDSC for helping pull this together. On that note, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.